So really what I want to do is establish our land base, our Shawnee land base in this Ohio River Valley. Okay, I want you guys to understand why the Shawnees are important in this story, even though we didn't necessarily start this what's been called a war, but why it was important to us and why we eventually got involved. Okay, so I want to establish our home in the Ohio River Valley. Okay, so Shawnee people, our homelands, our creation is in the Ohio River Valley. Okay, so everywhere that the Ohio River touches, that is where our homeland is. That is where our villages were since time immemorial, what we say. And so throughout history, the documented history that Europeans wrote about, our villages are documented to be in southern Illinois, southern Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and even further south into Savannah, Georgia, which is a corruption of Shawnee. So we're everywhere, and some pretty important people in Southeast American history, as Professor Stephen Warren has pointed out, they call us the greatest travelers on the earth. Shawnees are the greatest travelers, okay? So with that, I want to really focus in on our claim to our homeland in Kentucky. So there are two known villages in Kentucky during the historic period, okay? One is known as Lower Shawneetown, which is located at the confluence of the Scioto River with the Ohio. And I'll clear up pronunciation on those names for you. You people here in Ohio call that the Scioto, which is an improper pronunciation of a Wyandotte word. It's not even a Shawnee word. That river is actually called Skinoto River in Wyandotte. And that got corrupted into Scioto, and then now you guys say Scioto. Okay, so number one, that's number one. We occupied, so that became what is known as Chillicothe Town at the confluence of the mouth, which is now Portsmouth, Ohio. And that was a documented Shawnee town from around the 1720s or 30s to about 1758, okay? At various points in history, it was known as Shawnee Town, Old Town. You see that. The Shawnees are divided into 5 different bands, and our main division is called the Chillicothe Band. And so that was the name of our town for that band, just like the Piqua, Kispokota, Mikoche, all these other different bands, they had their capital towns named a certain name. And every time that town moved, because of warfare, there was a new town built with the same name. So that's what confuses historians a lot of times. They don't understand which town is being talked about, okay? So Lower Shawneetown was located there. It's the home of the Shawnees on the Ohio River. There was a letter in 1734 written by, I won't pretend to pronounce that French name, Francois there, but he described an English trader's warehouse there at Shawneetown. It was probably George Crowans that he was talking about, and William Trent. He described it as the home of the Shawnees on the Ohio River, and it was then visited by Celeron in 1749 when he planted his leaden plates at every major mouth of every river on the Ohio. In 1751, Gist, Croghan, and Montour accompanied Robert Callender there and visited the town, and then Gist wrote about Shawneetown in 1751 when he visited there. This was from his journal, this account here, from Gist's journal. Tuesday the 29th. Set out to the mouth of Scioto Creek, opposite to the Shanoa town. Here we fired our guns to alarm the traders, who soon answered, "Come," and ferried us over to the other town. The land about the mouth of Scioto Creek is rich but broken, fine bottoms upon the rivers and creek. You can see that he's land speculating right there already. He is land speculating in that statement. He is letting people back east know what kind of land they are going to encounter there. It is situate upon both sides of the River Ohio, just below the mouth of Scioto Creek, and contains about 300 men. He's also letting them know how many men they're going to encounter when they try to take this place. There are about 40 houses on the south side of the river and about 100 on the north side of the river, with a kind of state house about 90 feet long. So that was our council house. That's where all state business was handled. Has a light covering of bark, which they hold their councils. So, as we can see from this account, we have 40 houses on the south side of the Ohio River in Kentucky. So the north bank the south bank of the Ohio, northern Kentucky, we have 40 Shawnee families living there. This place is basically destroyed in 1758 and not reoccupied. And it's not reoccupied for a couple of different reasons. Number one is it was a huge flood, like a 100-year kind of flood. It flooded out the town. There had been other smaller floods before that, but this one was one that, it makes it hard to recuperate from. And also, because of the French and Indian War, that place is dangerous for Shawnees to live because the Ohio River Valley, or the Ohio River, is the major highway that the military is using to go to the Illinois country. And so when you have boats of military men coming right through the middle of your town, it makes it very hard to keep your families protected there, okay? So that was the other reason why this town was moved further up the Scioto Creek, or the Scioto River. And from there, it was moved up, further up, okay? So we have a Wyandotte oral story that was recorded in the 1800s in Kansas about the Shawnee people building that town there at the mouth of the Scioto River. That story states that basically in the early 1700s, there was a hunting party of Wyandottes at the mouth of that town. And at that point, there was no town there yet, or at that point in history, there was not a town. There's been, over thousands of years, archaeologists have found evidence of town after town after town at periods of time. So at that point, there wasn't a town there. It was a cooling off period. The Wyandottes are hunting there. They see on the river Ohio a party of canoes coming up the Ohio River from the west. They hail them to come ashore. The people in the canoes introduce themselves as Shawnee. And they say that they're coming back up to their homelands from the south and that they're looking for a place to build their town. And the Wyandottes tell them, here's a good place. No one lives here right now. There's plenty of deer around here. It's a great place for a town. So that's where the Shawnees build Chillicothe. So that's a little bit of an oral story incorporated into the archaeological evidence that archaeologists have found dating the refounding of that town. There's a huge story about why we were out of the Ohio River Valley for a short period of time. We don't have time for that, I don't know if maybe Steve may go into that a little bit, I don't know, but that's a whole nother conference if you guys are interested in what happened there. So this is an overview of what we're looking at in that area. He's talking about 100 houses on this side, 40 houses over here. I think personally that the 100 houses in the council house was on this side. This seems to be the lower portion and what would have been better for cornfields, in my opinion. So I think that, and obviously the 40, they're somewhere in here. The next place in Kentucky that is a Shawnee place is Esquipakitiki. Esquipakitiki is a town known as Blue Licks place. That's what that Shawnee word means. Esquipakitiki is, in Shawnee we have the same word we use for blue and green, okay? And so that's what you're seeing referenced in that word, in that town. And that, by the way, is actually the reason that it is called Kentucky today. It's a corruption of that Esquipakitiki, Skipakitiki, Pakitiki, Kentucky. So it's further evidence this is a Shawnee place. We are the only known tribe to have villages in Kentucky during European contact. Okay? So Esquipakitiki is basically the Blue Licks, the place where Daniel Boone ends up going and setting up shop and long hunting. Well, the whole reason why he goes there is because he was told about that place by another man who was an Indian trader that lived at that village with the Shawnees, okay, in the 1750s, early 50s. That man was John Finley, who you see down there at the bottom. He had a trading storehouse there in 52. That, in the traders' journals and stuff, that was known as Little Picktown, or Pickwa. That was another one of our divisions that I talked about, Chillicothe, okay? So it was primarily along Upper Howard Creek, occupied from about 1718 to about 54. Again, French and Indian War era is causing problems here. There in 1754 or 36, the French took a census, counted 200 Shawnees living there. John Finley consequently told Daniel Boone about this place during Braddock's War in 1754, the battle on the Monongahela. Braddock had a bunch of teamsters pulling his baggage for his army. Daniel Boone was a young man, 18 years old. He's working alongside John Finley as teamsters. The whole trip up to Pittsburgh, Finley's filling Boone's young mind with these wild, beautiful stories of Esquipakitiki, Kentucky, what a beautiful place it is, and where you can go and get rich. There are a lot of deer there, and there's lots of ginseng there. So a lot of people don't realize, but one of the other things besides deer skins that long hunters were going after was ginseng as well. It was a global trade back then, as it is now. Chinese were after American ginseng in the 1770s, just like they are now. So this is John Filson's map. It shows the area of Kentucky. It shows where the Indian paths are that go through there. Obviously, you guys can't see it great where you're at, but if you want to, I would advise look up John Filson's map of Kentucky. You can really focus in on where some of these places I'm talking about. He marks where the Blue Licks were. All of that. Again, with my presentation, I want to bring home the human side of our story, the people, the faces of the villages here. It's one thing to read about this stuff in history, and it's just boring facts on paper. But when you put real people's faces to the atrocities that happened and what we're going to be talking about, if that doesn't hit you in your feelers, you're not human. I don't know what else I could say to get you to understand how much this means to us, So these are photos of, modern day people, our families today that are representing historic Shawnees in these photos. Things that we do at CFT, which you guys can have the chance to learn about later. And please help us continue to educate and bring this message to more folks of Ohio. So it brings us to something we've talked about a little earlier, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, 1768. It's a series of illegal land sales. That's what it was. It was a treaty of a sale of land that the people that were participating in it had no right to be doing. It was your neighbor selling your house out from underneath you without the deed to your house. Is what it was, okay? So what happens is we have Sir William Johnson, who was the Northern Indian agent, and we have John Stewart, who was the South Indian agent. They were both, like I said, petitioning the Board of Trade for treaties to be negotiating to formalize a boundary line established by the 1763 Royal Proclamation that we talked about earlier to resolve concerns of colonial settlers and officials and land speculators. The Board of Trade approved this request in 1768 and stipulated where the boundary line was to be drawn. The boundary line would start at Fort Stanwix, which is up in New York. It would proceed south and west to the confluence of the Ohio and the Kanawha rivers, up the Kanawha River to the headwaters, where it is located in present-day West Virginia. Then it would head south to the Spanish East Florida. At that time, Florida was Spanish territory. And as I said, what you see in this, it starts at Stanwix, it goes down, and then it goes west. Well, what it leaves out is Johnson's adopted family, the Mohawk community in New York, and the Iroquois Confederacy in New York. That's exactly what he was doing. He was protecting his immediate interests, his immediate family in the Iroquois, which had no claim to Kentucky in this area, only by their own arrogance and boasting had this claim, which the Shawnees do not recognize, or any other tribe in the Ohio River Valley. You don't own this land. You can't claim something that you do not live on, period. And so they were experiencing white settlement up the Hudson River into the Mohawk River Valley. It was putting pressure on the Iroquois communities up there. They devised this plan as a way to divert settlement, white settlement, into a place where other Indians were living and divert it from their people that they were trying to protect, okay? In America, that's all they need is a piece of paper. They know that if they have that piece of paper, no matter what, they can eventually take it by force because they have the numbers of people that it takes to do that, right? And the subterfuge that it takes to do that. So they had no problems, and they knew that this wasn't the Iroquois land in Kentucky, in this area, that they were, that they had to buy it from them. But they knew with that piece of paper, they had God's given right to go on and do what they were going to do anyway, okay? So this whole war, make no mistake about it, this whole Lord Dunmore's war was all about land speculation. And America, and specifically Virginia's hunger for land. That's what it was all about, okay? Prior to receiving this approval, the Six Nations negotiated this treaty with the Cherokee Nation to stop the war between the northern and southern tribes, basically. There was an ongoing war which comes into play when we talk about the Yellow Creek Massacre. Okay. It's negotiated at Johnson's home at Johnson Hall, was signed in February of '68 and ended a war that was fought between the nations after repeated petitions from Virginia and North Carolina in response to Cherokee requests, which Johnson resisted for months. Once the Board of Trade's instructions were received, Stewart and Johnson requested the Indian nations to attend councils in order to negotiate the boundary. The first council was held by Stewart, where he negotiated the Treaty of Hard Labor with the Cherokee. The treaty was concluded October 17, '68, and drew a boundary line from the confluence of the Ohio and Kanawha rivers to the headwaters of the Kanawha, then south to Spanish East Florida again, like we said. He then called a council. Johnson called a council in the north to be held at Stanwix. Indians began arriving at Stanwix in August, with the negotiations lasting through September and October. November 5th, 1768, representatives from the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Tuscarora, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca signed the boundary line treaty on and ceded interest in land east of the south of the boundary to Great Britain. So basically, like it says, they signed on behalf of the Six Nations, the Shawnees, the Delaware, and the Mingo. And let me clear up another term that we talked about, Mingo. The Mingo are not the Seneca, okay? Completely different peoples, right? And the Mingo is an amalgamated community, okay? And that's who the Seneca Cayuga Nation of Oklahoma is today. It is an amalgamated community of refugees. Okay, so in the Mingo community, there are members of all Six Nations. There are people that descend from citizens of all Six Nations. The Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, the Cayugas, the Tuscaroras, the Senecas. But there are also many, many, many families from other tribes that no longer exist today, like the Piscataway, like the Nanticoke, the Piscataway, Nanticoke, Tutelo, Saponi, Kanoi, Susquehannocks, who are later known as Conestogas. All of those people do not exist as nations anymore, but their descendants are existing today as the Seneca Cayuga Nation of Oklahoma, okay? These were people that went to, the genesis of the Seneca Cayuga people is on the Susquehanna River at a place today called Sunbury, or Shamokin, historically is what it was known as, right? This is where it began. This is where Logan's father was the head man of, who we talked about earlier. He was basically sent there from Onondaga, from the Confederacy, to keep tabs on all of these refugees that were living there, okay? And that place attracted a lot of people that were being pushed from their lands further south and east along the eastern seaboard, okay? So the Seneca Cayuga and the Mingo are a very mixed ethnic community who are not the Seneca that you read about, the Seneca proper. The Seneca proper are located in New York and also in Canada, okay? But I just wanted to clear that term up because it is very confusing that people that do not understand that. It is even confusing to us, to Indians that are members of those communities, because that has not been passed down. That has not, the genesis of that has not been passed down. But it's hidden in all of these original documents, in all of these actions, okay? So that's why the Mingo people have more on side with the Shawnees and the Delawares in the Ohio River Valley than they do with Onondaga, the Confederacy up in New York. These are people that are bucking the system of Onondaga that are going into the Ohio country, okay? The boundary line was then extended west beyond the Board of Trade's instructions, but why did that happen? Because of the influence, because of that family connection that I said with Johnson. His wife, one of his wives, he had numerous wives, one of his wives was a Mohawk woman, the sister of Joseph Brant, and that is the connection that he had to that community. So because of that influence the Six Nations had with Johnson, they were in a position to negotiate a treaty favorable to their interests by negotiating a boundary line that veered sharply to the west once it reached the Six Nations' southern border. Johnson was looking out for his own personal interest and the interests of land speculators and colonial settlers. He was also concerned about the French intrigue from the Spanish forts and the communities along the Mississippi River, and wanted to check this French threat to British and colonial interests. Johnson also inserted a wide wedge between American Indian nations to the west, attempting to stop a pan-Indian union from forming again. The pan-Indian union he's talking about is Pontiac's uprising. There were many, Tecumseh and the Prophet were not the first alliance that tried to stop this. There were numerous other alliances prior to that were trying to stop Western settlement into our communities, right? This is what he was trying to stop from forming again, which is what they had experienced in Pontiac's uprising. Plus the nations would then be at odds with one another, and it would also aid in keeping the union from forming as well. So it did exactly what he intended it to do. Next slide. Again, you guys saw this earlier in the presentation. I'm not going to go over that, but understand that these were the boundaries we're talking about in those treaties. The impact of the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. The Board of Trade was concerned about starting renewed conflict with and between the American Indian nations. Stewart also complained about the Fort Stanwix boundary line, which negatively impacted his relationship with the Cherokee and called into question the line negotiated in the Treaty of Hard Labor. The Board of Trade and General Jeffrey Amherst chided Johnson and ordered him to renegotiate the line and for it to end at the confluence of the Ohio and the Kanawha rivers. Johnson refused. In future years, the 1770 Treaty of Lochaber with the Cherokee was negotiated to adjust the line drawn by the Treaty of Hard Labor, and the Fort Stanwix line was adjusted in 1773 with Pennsylvania to finalize the line of property also known as the Purchase Line. March of 1773, the Moravian preacher John Etwain, who was a group of Germans that came from Moravia to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, that's where Bethlehem takes its name from, to establish a church there specifically with the purpose to convert Indians to Christianity, okay? So Etwain visited Sir William Johnson and informed him that the Six Nations thought the Delaware and the Shawnee were planning a war against them since the Moravian converts had been moved from the Susquehanna River to the Muskingum. So there had been a recent removal of the converted Delawares and Mohicans that were in the converted towns from the Susquehanna River Valley among the Mingo towns to the Muskingum River Valley right here among where the Delawares had moved as well, their stronghold and their center of government here to the Muskingum, okay? So they wanted them closer to them to protect them. So if we acknowledge this treaty, do you think that Etwain would be saying that the Delawares and the Shawnees are planning a war against the Iroquois? Okay, yeah, we agree, you sold our land out from under us, we're just going to roll over and, accept that. That's not happening here, right? So Daniel Boone, which brings us to Daniel Boone and his involvement in this. So like I said earlier, he first came to Kentucky in 67, and this is before Treaty of Fort Stanwix, right? So this is a year before that. He's already coming across the line because of what Finley told him to get rich. He's poaching on Indian land. He's poaching. Him and his brother went on a long hunt. Boone first learned of Kentucky from Finley, like I said. In 69, Boone took 5 other men, Stewart, Finley, Holden, Mooney, and Cooley, into Kentucky for a long hunt. In December, they were captured by a party of Shawnee on horseback led by the captain, Will Emery. A lot of us had English names as well, so don't let that fool you and make you seem like that's weird. The Shawnees confiscated all their skins, the horses, and the belongings. Captain Will gave every man a trade gun. This is a cool thing this guy did, right? This shows you that we don't want war. We just want you off our land, okay? So he gave every man a trade gun, powder, shot, 2 pair of moccasins, and told them, "Now, brothers, go home and stay there. Don't come here anymore. For this is the Indians' hunting ground, and all the animals, skins, and furs are ours. If you are so foolish as to venture here again, may you be sure the wasp and yellow jackets will sting you severely. We are the yellow jackets." Okay? So this is a warning to Boone and his men. You think Boone listened? No. What'd he do? They go right back over the mountains, they resupply, and they come right back. Okay? So, after this warnings, this happens a couple of times. Eventually, Shawnees, we realize these guys don't get it. They don't understand our, being nice to them. So now we have to go a little further. It's in those instances when people are killed. You got to prove a point to them, and the only way we knew to prove a point is to take lives at the end of the day, right? So that's what happens later on. So this leads up to an attack on Shawnees at Horseshoe Bottoms, which was north of where Portsmouth is. It's on a bend in the river that forms a horse head, and the look of a horse head from an aerial view, and it's where a small Shawnee camp had been established in between the new Chillicothe and the old one at Portsmouth, okay? So in April of 1774, after the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, 22-year-old George Rogers Clark arrives at the mouth of the Little Kanawha, modern-day Parkersburg, West Virginia. This site had been chosen months earlier for the rendezvous. 80 or 90 male settlers from different parts of Virginia were set to arrive over the next week or so. From here, they had planned to travel by flatboat and canoe down the Ohio to what would become Limestone, Kentucky, modern-day Maysville, Kentucky, where they would then follow an old buffalo trace into Kentucky. And while they were there waiting for all the parties to arrive at the mouth of the Little Kanawha, an advanced group of surveyors had already descended the river and ran into Indians. William Crawford's account of the incident, who we heard mentioned earlier, the William Crawford that was involved in this war, his account was, he wrote for George Washington soon after the events had happened, stated that the surveying party was stopped by the Shawnee Indians. The Shawnee had been encamped near the mouth of the Scioto River at a place then known as Horsehead Bottoms, and a small Indian village was on that site on the eastern bank of the Scioto River, 2 miles above modern-day Portsmouth. These Shawnees had stopped this party. We know what survey equipment looks like. And that is one thing we will not tolerate on our land is survey equipment, okay? So they were seeing this. They knew what this meant. Crawford stated some of the white people then attacked the encampment and ransacked. So Crawford's men, George Rogers Clark, they perpetuated an attack on the Shawnees that were there before there was ever any hostilities, right? They attacked them, the encampment, ransacked it, killed several Indians, taking 30 horse loads of skins. News of this attack and possible Indian retaliation soon reached Clark and others at the Little Kanawha. As Clark would later relate, the whole party of settlers was enrolled and determined to execute the project of forming a settlement in Kentucky. As we had every necessary store that could be thought of, after some discussion, the determination was to cross the country and to confront the Shawnee and Indian threat head on. They know what they were doing, head on. And surprise attack was planned on the Indians at the mouth of the Scioto. Another settler by the name of Michael Cressup counseled against the attack and instead recommended that the men return back to Wheeling, where they had a much larger force and they could rally with them and come down, and they were still going to do what they had planned to do, but he just didn't think they had enough men to do it, right? So it just shows this was premeditated. This was premeditated. This was not spot on, a spot of the moment in the heat of the act, premeditated. George Crowan, he's Pennsylvania's deputy Indian agent at Fort Pitt. He had sent for some Shawnee chiefs, whom he then detained as quasi-hostages from December of 1773 till April of 1774. During that time, they are there at Fort Pitt. On January 25th, those Shawnee chiefs were fired upon. None of them, luckily, were injured in their huts that they were staying in at the mouth of Sawmill Run in Pittsburgh by a party of Virginia militia assembled by none other than Connolly, who we were talking about earlier, right? They had been sent by Dunmore to maintain the authority of that province at the forks of the Ohio. We know that story from earlier, April 16th. So after that, a canoe loaded with trade goods headed for the Shawnee town. So even with all of this going on, Shawnees are still conducting business as usual. When the trade is happening, that goes to show you that there is no intentions of war, right? When war is predicated, we are stopping the trade. We are either basically taking the traders that are in our town hostages, or we're sending them back to Fort Pitt, one or the other, right? So the fact that the trade was still going on shows you there were no evil intent by the Shawnees, even to this point, when they had, been attacked and subterfuge has been used against them, right? So this canoe load of goods that was being transported and owned by a trader out of Fort Pitt known as Richard Butler, who comes into play later, who is the husband of Cornstalk's sister, Non-Helema, and has 2 children with her. That is why this becomes so complicated, because of these family connections. That is the reason, most likely, that Cornstalk is not as aggressive in going after the Americans in the beginning and tries to counsel against it. He has family connections to these people through his sister, right? He's trying to maintain the peace because of his sister. And he may have had friends on that side that he was trying to keep the peace with, okay? So this canoe load was attacked at the mouth of the Little Beaver River by a party of 3 Cherokees that were in the area. 1 man was killed, 1 was wounded, and 1 escaped. David Zeisberger, who was one of those Moravian preachers at the Moravian towns on the Muskingum River here in Ohio at the time, says in his Schonbrunn diaries that on April 23rd, we learned through Indians who came from Pittsburgh that 3 Cherokee who had recently visited our town had killed 2 white people. They had been proceeding down the Ohio with the traders from Pittsburgh, and the traders had the misfortune or the mistake of showing these Cherokees this quantity of silver, trade goods that they were carrying, silver earrings and nose rings and things like that. So then these Cherokees decide they're going to murder them for the goods, okay? A few days after this, on April 27th, Cressup and a party of men who had returned from the attack on Horsehead Bottoms heard of a canoe with Indians coming down the river. So they think it's this canoe load of Indians that had attacked the traders. They go after them. They set out to meet the canoe carrying the 2 Indians and the 2 whites. These were the men that Butler had sent to the Shawnee towns, so they were not the Cherokees. They were the men that the trader Butler had sent to the Shawnee towns to help bring back skins that were at his his posts that were in the Shawnee towns there. And they were coming to bring the skins back down the Ohio, which those people were killed and scalped by Cressup and his party. The next day, several more canoes were discovered coming down the Ohio from just above Wheeling, West Virginia, containing Indians. This was the group of Shawnee chiefs that had been kept as hostages at Fort Pitt and had been fired on over the winter by Connolly's men. So they're getting back to their home after being held hostage, coming down the river, and Cressup and his men try to attack them too. So Cressup and the men pursued them that night while the Shawnee chiefs were then encamped at the mouth of Captina Creek, 20 miles below Wheeling. He attacked them, killed one, wounding several others, who then escaped overland to the Delaware towns on the Muskingum. Which brings us to the coup de grace, the final straw that broke the camel's back, the attack of the Mingos at Yellow Creek. These are photos that I took of the actual place where it occurred. This is the mouth of Yellow Creek here, going into the Ohio River. This is the Indian side, so this is under this bridge, the creek flows up, and the Seneca Cayuga encampment was just up the way, most likely in a place where there is now a modern-day campground. And the Baker's settlement was just across the river, basically in the area where it's a gravel parking lot now, is where Baker's cabin sat historically. So there's now an industry set up right there. There's actually a tiny little marker there that said this is where the Yellow Creek Massacre occurred. Not much more than that. So anyway, Yellow Creek Massacre occurred on around April 30th. There is conflicting stories to the date of when it actually occurred, okay? So some say April 30th, some say May 2nd, or, anyway, it's at the end of April, beginning of May. It's carried out by the Daniel Greathouse at Baker's Cabin on the West Virginia side of the Ohio River, opposite the mouth of Yellow Creek. John Sappington is the man that fires the first shot, killing Logan's brother, who was called John Petty. Remember I told you we had English names. Don't let that fool you. These are Indians we're talking about. Accounts vary on the number of Indians that were killed. Some accounts say 8, some say 12, so anywhere in between there, it doesn't matter. That's too many that died for no reason. I'm going to tell you the personal side of how this occurred, because most people don't know what actually happened there. They know this happened. They don't know the details that are ugly and are disgusting, okay? These men's names, Greathouse and Sappington, Baker, are the scourge of society. And those names should still carry that weight as far as I'm concerned. It sickens me to tell this story, and it makes me emotional every time I tell it, because I think about my family and my wife and kids and what they must have felt like to have had this happen to their families and heard about it, okay? So this is a premeditated murder that occurs. What happens is Baker had his cabin, his trading cabin there on the banks. They were friends. Both sides knew one another. These were not people that just ran into each other occasionally. These were people that hunted together from time to time, partied together from time to time. And in fact, that is the guys that Baker brings this group of Seneca Cayugas over with. The promise of a barbecue and a shooting match and a party, right? He didn't bring them over to sell them liquor. He had them over to give them liquor and a barbecue, right? That is what brings them over, okay? That's what they tell them. And in the meantime, Greathouse, Sappington, with a large group of men, a militia, a local militia, basically. See, I'm running out of time real fast. I told you. I want to tell the story, and then I'll give you time to ask questions. They agree to set up an ambush, okay? So there is a party of militia that hides in the back of the area where there is a woodshed, and on the signal, when the first Indians are being killed, they know that they're to go to the Ohio River bank and watch for any Indians that are still coming from the camp that will try to help their families that are being murdered. So that's exactly what they do. Inside the house, during the party, John Petty is drinking. He gets drunk. The story is there's a coat hanging on the wall. He picks it up. It's Baker's coat. He puts it on. He's parading around. Look at me. I'm a white man. I'm a white man. At that moment, the sign was given. Sappington fires the first shot. Shoots Petty, point blank range, in the coat. He drops to the ground. he immediately jumps on top of his back, pulls his knife out of his belt, lifts his head, slices his throat, and says, this is the quote from his other people that participated in this, told what he said. Thus I have served many a deer. So he was looking at John Petty, nothing more than another deer he had shot and cut his throat. Immediately when that happens, Logan's sister, who is not really his sister, it's his cousin, but in our way, matrilineal society, our mothers, relatives are our brothers and sisters. Our aunts are really our mother. We would call them mother as well. So that's who we're talking about. Logan's cousin on his mother's side has Gibson's baby on her back in a cradle board, has Gibson's baby in her belly, 8 to 9 months pregnant. Immediately, they shoot her point blank range right between on the forehead, right where the brow band of the cradle board that was holding the cradle board was. She falls immediately to the ground. The baby falls. They had the foresight to not kill that baby. That was the only one that survived, was that baby in the cradle board. I don't know why they didn't do it. Because they weren't scared of Gibson, because, if you think you could kill his wife and his unborn child and he's not going to get mad, which the man did not, because there's not a place on this earth that you could hide from me if you do that to my family. Okay, so that tells me what Gibson felt about his wife. That's why I get so angry about this story every time I tell it, right? So Gibson, or what they do is they drag her body out, they cut the baby out of her womb, they take the baby in the placenta, they hang it over a meat pole. At this time, from all the screams, gunshots, men from the other side tried to come over. The militia party on the banks fire upon them. Shoot a few of them, they aren't able to get across. They have to go back across the other side, and they don't make it. All of those settlers immediately vacate, go to Fort Pitt for protection. They know what they just started. They started a war. They did exactly what they were told to do. They hide at Fort Pitt. The survivors go and tell Logan. They find him on the warpath. He's headed south to beat up on the Cherokees. He comes back. He gets revenge. Okay? So that culminates in the other things that we were talking about earlier. I had slides to talk about that. But you need to understand this Yellow Creek Massacre and the disgusted, just the vileness that was involved in it. Okay? So I'm going to end that there. Hopefully Travis and Steve Warren will seal the rest of it up for me and bring you guys up to speed on what happens after that.